Welcome to the Two Blokes Chatting radio show on 94.7 The Pulse. Music, interviews, news, and, well, Two Blokes Chatting. Now, here are the two blokes.
94.7 The Pulse, indeed it is. In 1967, the man who runs Geelong Marking was a 10-year-old boy, and he was sitting in the crowd at the MCG when Geelong played Richmond in the grand final. And a man who was out in the ground running around wearing number 6 for the Cats, Gareth Andrews, is on the line. Good morning, Gareth.
G'day, Rob. How are you going?
Excellent.
Josh,
a long time ago. Josh Barnes from the Geelong Advertiser is with us, and I think you're familiar with him as well.
Well, yes, I know of Josh. Familiar with him.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Now let's talk about your CV. It's quite extraordinary. You were a very good sports person, and similarly to Ian Redpath, you might have had a decision to make about footy or cricket back in the middle 60s. Someone told me the other day that your only GCA performance yielded 8 for 12 or something like that. So
my only game, I played one game for Newtown. Back in the Newtown's over 100 years old. I played one game. Might have been somebody reminded me of this recently. I played one game after school. I left school. And I got 8 for 16. And there are lots of other blokes that got 8 for, but not 8 for 16. So I've still, we've got to get that bloke to get 9 wickets to take over.
So although very good at cricket, did you not have the same passion for it as the footy?
Well, strangely enough, I was struggling right for that period of time when I was sort of leaving school with a chronic back, and it was just through growing too fast, and I was always awkward anyway. So that's my kicking. So we don't have to bring that up again.
No, that's good.
And I was at that stage. I was getting. I can remember playing fast bowling one game for school for Geelong College, and sitting out after we got them out, literally sitting the rest of the innings in a chair because my back was just gone, and it troubled me a few times in those early years, to the extent that there've been some interesting stories out of all of that. I think the most, if you can bear with me for 1 minute, one of the most interesting and misunderstood stories was in my first year in 1965, we were to play Fitzroy at the Fitzroy ground up in, lovely old ground there. I think that was the last year they were playing.
Old Brunswick Street?
Yeah, Brunswick Street. And Alistair Lord, so and unbeknownst to anyone, as it turned out, Alistair Lord was coming over because he was trying to get a move, I think it was to Penguin, to captain coach. And Alistair was only 25 when he first attempted to leave Geelong. And so I rang up, and I got up in the morning at Queen's College, literally a couple of kilometres from the ground, and rang the club doctor, Kevin Threlford, and said, look, I can hardly, my back's really crooked, I can hardly, get up. And he said, well, there's classic things happening back in those days. We'll meet you at the ground, bring your gear, and we'll see how you go, and we'll massage you and get you into gear. As it turned out, Alistair Lord planned to meet the club at the ground because he was flying over to Melbourne. He didn't want to go down to Geelong. So in the meantime, the club, without Alistair knowing it, brought up his gear. And literally, from the moment I hit the ground, they were working frantically to get Alistair to play. And rather than me run out onto the ground that day, out came Alistair Lord. I don't know what round it was. To all intents and purposes, having left Geelong, and taking up his position. But the story was always that I was this poor young kid, first year, sacrificed to get Alistair Lord again. And the reality was Alistair stayed on and for a couple of years and became a friend and teammate.
Yeah,
that was my back.
So Geelong College, a lot of stories about Geelong College and grammar players, John Newman being the most famous from the grammar that made their way to Geelong. How was your footy journey in those early days to get you to Cardinia Park?
It was almost a given, Rob. I was a Geelong boy, followed the Cats all my life, and in fact, the 2 years before I played at Geelong. I was training there in May. One of the funny things was about in say 1963, Bob Davis, who'd watched me play schoolboy footy, and said, "You're going to come to Geelong, son," and all that sort of stuff. He came to me one day and he said, "Tell me about this boy Newman at the grammar." So this is before John. So Sam's exactly a year older than me. And Sam went the year before I went. He went in 64. So he was a year later than the premiership, and I was the year after that. But Woofer asked me, first of all, what's this, Bob Davis's voice. It's funny how the wheel turns.
And interestingly, later we'll talk more about the transfer to Richmond, but there was a stage where John Newman also was very, very close to moving up to Richmond, I do believe. So you've got a couple of parallels.
Yeah, we do. And I remember that the fact that there was, I think it was a suggestion for about 5 minutes that Sam would go up to Richmond, but there were a few swaps between Richmond and Geelong. Paul Serra went up to Richmond. There are others that don't quickly.
Gary Davidson.
Gary Davidson, of course, the late Gary Davidson from last year. And then Rex Hunt came down to Geelong in the swap with me. So it was. There were. I just can't. There were a couple of others who I just right off the top. I can't.
Graham Landy.
Graham Landy, he was the bloke I was actually thinking of.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, there was a few for whatever. So,
was there any particular reason for that? Was it just a good relationship between the clubs, or did it just work out? There were so many swaps.
Mine was definitely. So back in the days, I was working in property, real estate, and my office back in those early days, when I went to Richmond, was in Richmond, and just up the road from Graham Richmond's hotel. And Graham Richmond, Graham Richmond was Richmond, by name and by the whole personality, and it was a pretty tough personality. You wouldn't get away with a Graham Richmond these days, but he was just dynamic. You had free reign, of course. There were no, as far as moving clubs or anything, whatever Graham wanted to do, he could do. Literally, it just took dollars, and a lot of very good talking. So I just got to know Graham, and the other thing too is, because I was in Melbourne in the last 3 or 4 years of my footy career, before I went to Richmond, I was either trained with Melbourne or with Richmond in the last couple of years on the other one training night down at Geelong, and the other with either of those two league clubs.
And I do believe your former teammate Wayne Closter did the same thing in his Army days. I remember reading stories that he trained at Richmond as well to help him service his AFL or VFL career, I should say.
Yeah. And the interesting thing in all of that is, every footy club trained the same, except the very good clubs like, Hawthorn and Richmond with Tommy Hafey and John Kennedy, respectively, who really did take training up a measure. But it was all kick to kick, warm up, then circle work, and then run at a ball that was sitting on the ground. Just go and nearly almost kill yourself. But there were no tactics taught to training, so there were no set plays. So you weren't learning anything about the tactical side of what your game plan was. The only thing in each instance was I would never train with the club the week we were playing them. So
Yep.
I'd go down to Geelong 2 nights that week, or train with Melbourne University Blacks.
Gareth, what was interesting to me was that you and Rex were like for likes, both 6'3" or 4", very strong marks. Was Graham Richmond wanting you because they didn't want Rex Hunt, or they saw him as a sacrifice?
Oh, no, they actually... See, Rex was better known and became... And in fact, as soon as he moved to Geelong, he went straight to centre-half forward. So Rex was legitimately a better centre-half forward than a back. So Richmond had Royce, and so it was becoming apparent to Richmond. I went to Richmond because I was playing my best footy at centre-half back. And they had Robert McGee there, and, they had a strong backline. It was just, you fit it in wherever you fit it in. In fact, I played in the grand final in the back pocket because I was on Sam Kekovich. Sam and Barry Cable were the two guys to be who were going to make the difference if there was going to be any difference that year, albeit North were never going to win it.
Yeah, it was a pretty impressive Richmond outfit you walked into, but oddly, everyone wants to play in a grand final. You played in a losing one against Richmond. Just what was the, I suppose, training with them made it easier, that emotional mindset of changing jumpers extraordinarily during a season, as opposed to over the pre-season, and then walking into a real premiership chance, which from memory Geelong probably wouldn't have been at that stage.
No.
What was the mindset like?
The mindset was, number one, Geelong had this great run during the 60s, and then we were starting to not tumble down the ladder. I think we're in the 4 as it was then in the 60s, probably 8 times, and won one flag. A little bit like the return that we've had in the last 10 years.
Yeah,
since 2011.
Ironically.
Yeah, ironically. And so we, I left Geelong because I was sick of driving up and down, even because we were driving without seat belts. You'd have half a dozen pops after a game. You'd drive back to Melbourne, and it was back in the years where the road toll was seriously high for young people.
Yeah, 10.34. I remember being an advertising campaign when seatbelts come in.
Yeah, so it was only a matter of time, really, before something might happen. And you could drive. There was no speed limit, so not 100 k's an hour, 100 miles an hour. You'd be doing all of this. So it was, and also Polly and I just didn't get on. Polly, as my coach, and it's been written about, and I've talked about my relationship with Polly. It was an odd one, even when he was my captain, because Polly was a perfectionist, and I was awkward. I'm a left-sided person who happened to kick right-footed, and it wasn't in the days where you could kick both feet, either foot. And it was just time for me to go. And Richmond wanted me. That was the interesting part of it. Here was the side that it was really on a roll in a great era. At the end of 1973, won the flag, and they fought for the following summer to get me to come over to fill what they saw as one hole in their back line. That's what they wanted. So Rex actually didn't fit into that hole.
So being a Geelong boy all your life, and you proved that by coming back to the club, the premiership, how does that sort of sit with you now when you review your career?
Rob, my career, without having played a premiership, my career would not look like it feels like now, because it does take you to, into different space if you've played in a flag. There's no doubt about that. And respectfully with Richmond, and they know this, and the people, some of my really dear friends on my foundation board, Michael Green, who has played in 4 Richmond premierships, is my chairman. So I've just got dear long-term life friends at Richmond, as well as at Geelong. And I actually my final decision was made when Geelong said to me before, we agreed that I'd move that week, and I had to tell Richmond literally within two hours after I'd been, on the Monday before the game on Saturday, Geelong said, and we're going to, we want to make sure you get your life membership at Geelong at the end of this year. So that was important to them because they knew, that I'd given it my best shot at Geelong, and they didn't want me to, fall short of that. And obviously, subsequently I could have won it a few times, I guess. as it turned out. But, so Geelong and I, and Richmond, there's no doubt about that. That side at that time, to be part of that era of a footy club, is pretty special.
It is indeed. Now, the irony is we could talk to you for hours and hours about footy, but the main reason you are on this morning's show is to talk about the foundation you just touched on that Michael Green chairs. And it's wonderful to see people who are aware of what the game has gifted you and are giving back. And just tell us a bit about Life Again and how it started with you and what it means to you now.
Life Again has been something that has evolved in the last 6 or 7 years. I tell the story of me being depressed in 2001, clinically depressed, but I realised that for about 10, 15, 20 years, so I got through that whole midlife era, which is, you talk about midlife crisis and all of it, but statistically, men and women suffer a low through midlife. Your life's changed. You're no longer free, so to speak. You're working. You're working your butt off. You've got families. You've got obligations. You've got needs. You're comparing yourself to others. All of that sort of stuff. Men's egos get in the road, and so I realised you don't suddenly say one day wake up depressed. And one of the things I was always keen about was to say most men, as I've even discovered in the last 6 years, don't still relate to words like depression and mental health. And if I can be allowed to say, we've branded the words, and we haven't used them that much yet, but we're rebuilding what we do. You say, well, how are you feeling? And the bloke will say, I'm just feeling shit house. And then they'll tell you why they're feeling that way. And it's all of life's burdens. So I established Life Again to really get that message out that it's okay to not feel depressed. It's okay to just feel like that because it's normal human behaviour. It's in some of the animals. They have that down period when you go from being this pumped up dude at 25 to a bent-shouldered, worried 45-year-old. And the message, I reckon, often misses most people. And we got, not-for-profit recognition as an organisation who was there getting that message out. And subsequently, in terms of where we're heading now, it's just growing with some of the work that we do.
We're with former Geelong and Richmond footballer Gareth Andrews, but we've changed tack. Gareth, I do a bit of work with a community bank, and we come across men's sheds, and it's been well documented the enormous value that organisation has created, or that model, bringing people, as you speak about, or a little older, together to work through these stages. Well, that model's well known. How does the Life Again model work?
So we're actually building on it. Men's Shed's terrific, and it's a physical place where men, and it's usually guys who have got skills with tools and that sort of stuff, and they can get together. Our model is, and we're developing our model. One of the things we're trying to do, again, when we got our DGR status, my role was to get the message out through speaking, through writing, through events, through all of that. Be seen and tell the story as much as you can. So we've never been run a program like Men's Shed, and even if you think about Beyond Blue is all about a message. Ring this phone number, and then you'll get referred to appropriate support and help and what have you. And they do a massive amount of research. So every model is different. One of the areas that we're looking at seriously at the moment, where there's a particular program I can't even announce yet that we're working on with state government, we're going into companies, and companies know that they've got to do something in the whole area of health. We call it positive health, so I avoid the word mental health. So positive health is what we talk about. And going into organisations who all have to make changes, but how they make that changes while the eye and the focus is still on profit, and all of that sort of thing. You know, the nature of the industry. It's always little bit like the issue in Indigenous Australia now is that, you know, you actually have to look back seriously at what's occurred in the past, whether it's sexism or whatever it is, it's behaviours and culture, and you've just got to make massive changes. And one of the biggest issues in business is, you know, the expectation, work harder and you'll do better, or be bossed by your leaders. No empathy, all of that sort of stuff. So there's a massive backstory to all of that, Rob.
Yeah, there is, and it's incredible. There's a lot happening in that similar space at the moment, changing culture, but there is no doubt that reviewing historical culture is the only way to change it, and it's fantastic the way you've explained what you're doing and why you're doing it, and I see it as a model that could change the way a lot of corporations deal with their staff. I think the smaller businesses get it right, but some of the bigger ones maybe lose track for all the reasons you just said.
The bigger ones. So one of our big programs is, for 6 years ago, I worked out one of the ways you can help blokes get out of their funk. So they're not necessarily depressed. That's why I don't use the word depressed. They're just in a funk. And I thought, how do you get them away? And it was then that we started taking men to the outback. And when I started I was introduced to a guy in a traditional owner, Johnny Little, his name is his property, traditional family, traditional Aboriginal country between Uluru and Alice Springs. And so I've been taking guys out there for 6 years into that space. And one of the most interesting parts about that work that we've been doing is that Johnny Little said to me once, you know, he said, look, you're doing this to help these guys. The most important thing is we love actually welcoming them. And the problem for you white fellas is no one comes out on country. And that on country can be Arnhem Land, it can be the Tiwis, it can be, you know, wherever in Australia. But interestingly enough, what we're doing now, particularly post-COVID, and we're setting it up right now, is to say how much do we know about the history of Aboriginal Victoria? And the model that you can take all around Australia. So this year, we're going to be taking trips into different important Aboriginal parts of Victoria. For example, down around the Geelong region, the Grampians and the Otways is Eastern Maar country. And the history of Eastern Maar is vivid, and it's a long history, and it predates white man for thousands of years. But we drive through it, we drive around it, and we don't know anything about that history. That the history is all there. And until we realise that, and, you know, we think we white fellas for 230 years in Australia, the only ones who know how to, you know, how to get food out of this country, to know how to protect the forests, to know how to fish, to save water. These people have been doing it successfully for thousands of years, and we just think we can tell them what to do.
I am genuinely excited to hear that, Gareth. It's been a bit of a bugbear for mine for some time about education being necessary to understand and deal with the present, but certainly change the future. And I like what you're doing. And at some stage in the not too distant future, in another format and another radio program, we'd like to investigate this more with you. But I just want to finish off this morning. We've talked about corporate Australia. We've talked about sporting Australia. You've been lucky enough, privileged enough to rub shoulders with the very best in both for a long period of time. I just want to throw a name at you. How good is Brian Cook at his job?
Brian Cook, Frank and I met Brian Cook in 1999, and he was contemplating his football future with West Coast Eagles, and Brian, where he'd had great success, and Brian and Brian was just impressive from the outset But more than that, the combination of Brian being smart enough to recognise the quality of a man that Frank is, and the way he ran a business, like he was all about, like Cookie's Bible back in the day was always this book called Good to Great. But I suspect that deep down, his many of his traits are based on following the Bible. I don't use it misappropriately, I hope, with Frank, that the way Frank ran a business and the cost of which became an empire of a business from a very humble building down in 174 Mirabel Street is just it's a masterly story, and Cookie was just smart enough to recognise it. So I think Cookie just had an innate smartness that's grown. He's grown with the job, and the success of the footy of our footy club has grown with Brian Cook, no doubt about it.
Yeah, there was interesting. I had the privilege of interviewing Brian. He mentioned about the sign behind Frank Costa's chair in the office about character before ability, and that's surely both of them have lived that, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the culture of Geelong, which when we took over on that Frank Costa-led board in 1999, effectively, it was the end of 98, it was sort of all over the place. We were a terrific club, and we'd been an almost great club, but Cookie always described us as, middling in terms of culture and all of the value type characteristics of any good organisation. And it was over the years that it's been built through Cookie and successive presidents, Frank and Colin Carter, and Craig Drummond will be an outstanding president. He is a very sharp man and as good a person as you want to meet, and people will really like Craig. Even though the biggest test for Geelong is going to be Cookie finishes at the end of this year, but he's not going far, so he will be on some form of retainer or whatever that might look like. And it's like, and it'll be a bit like playing Jeremy Cameron and Tommy Hawkins together. Is that you've got to make sure that it works, whatever comes in. Can learn from Cookie, and you just got to make sure that all works out as well. And Craig Drummond's the sort of person who can make sure that can happen, and Cookie's smart. Yeah,
and I imagine Brian Cook is clearly not a self-indulgent egomaniac, and I reckon his success is probably well known and being mentored and prepared for the job already, as he has done all through his career at the club.
Yeah, and he's always had a mentor, and I know his mentor well. He was a former player, not with Geelong, and he's been the person who Cookie can go to beyond Frank to just give sort of non-personal type, more really deep-seated, like Frank and Cookie become like father and son to a certain extent, and to be quite honest, it's like Frank's become Cookie's father, that Cookie had a rough upbringing.
Yeah.
So he became his genuine father figure.
Last question. You played with Dennis Marshall and Polly Farmer, who were the first of the high-profile recruits that have come to Geelong. Has Brian Cook been the best recruit Geelong has got in your time at the club?
Look, I reckon he's been a terrific recruit, no question. It's easy to say that. I like to think that in my time at the club, the best recruit we got was a bloke called Brad Ottens. Mr. September, in the first few years when we were on the board, no one wanted to come. If a high-profile player was up for grabs and Geelong would have a crack at them, none of them wanted to play for Geelong. They didn't see us as rating against the Richmonds and the Carlton, the bigger clubs, the Essendon, and back in those days, Sydney was up there, weren't they? But I don't mean even Sydney, because they've been a very successful club.
They have indeed, yes.
20 years. It was, But he was the first fellow and we took a bit of a risk with him. He'd been All-Australian when he started with Richmond and then had just fallen away a bit through injury. But he actually wanted to come to Geelong. I think he saw something in Brian Cook and Frank Costa again, and he wanted to come to Geelong. And now where we are really lucky is we are the go-to club. You know, we've got blokes who have lived down the coast, down in the Western District now, who want to go back to Geelong, who want to go down near the sea, who don't want to live in the city where they just want to get out and get away. And there's no, and a lot of them have come through the Falcons. So they're Geelong boys by through their footy careers almost. So we do have what was a disadvantage has been turned into an advantage.
Definitely, and ironically, the curse of the ruckman has probably cost Geelong a lot of serious tilts at a premiership since Brad Otten's retired. As you said, he was Mr. September, but it's just finding the right man for the job since he's gone has been a real issue. It's been
a really there have been disappointments, but there have been some guys who have had a real crack at it, but you know and it's such a critical position in any premiership side. If you go back through the history books, if you've got a good ruckman, you can go a long way to winning premierships.
Gareth, thank you very much for your time. That has been one of the more enlightening chats I've had for quite some time on various subjects. Best wishes with life again. It's wonderful work you're doing. I'd like to tap into you again in a few weeks and talk to it in another format, but I love the sound of the project and I really love your work at bringing the old and new Australia together. I think that's been a very refreshing part of the discussion this morning.
And I look forward to doing it again with you, Rob. It was I enjoyed the chat. Thank you, and g'day to Josh.
I couldn't get a word in. I was sitting here enjoying it all. It was that's good stuff.
Yeah, I do apologise. Sometimes I get in the zone. Gareth, thank you very much. I look forward to you chatting to you again. We really appreciate your time.
Okay, pleasure. See ya.